Cybersecurity concerns are ever evolving. OT cybersecurity is even more complex, and it's so much more than just software and hardware. How do you stay on top of it all? Aaron Crow has over 25 years experience with cybersecurity. 15 of those years focused on operational technology across multiple industries, and he wants to help you. Welcome to the Protect OT Cybersecurity Podcast, brought to you by Industrial Defender. Now here's your host, Aaron Crow.
Welcome to the podcast, and my friend Josh is on the line today. So we're going to dive into all things not OT cybersecurity, but more on the OT networking side, which everything kind of roots back to. So Josh, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about you and your company as well.
Hey Aaron, thanks for having me. I'm Josh Varghese with Traceroute. I started Traceroute almost 6 years ago now. As Aaron kind of alluded to, we are an OT networking consultancy. So our primary scope is consultation, design, product recommendations, procurement, configuration, testing, training, startup support, but just everything exclusively around the networking piece. So we're not programming the PLCs or the HMIs. In fact, that's kind of very specific. We're not stepping on the toes of the system integrator. What we're often doing is partnering with the system integrator, potentially, or the OEM, or maybe directly for the end user, to just kind of maybe fill out that very common gap that is OT networking as a discipline.
Yeah, and everything in OT now really ties and is kind of carried across that OT network. So you have your vendors, and they know their products, and they know the serial, the 4 to 20 milliamp. They know the ladder logic in their product. But when you're wanting to connect it, and it's a small, and they don't have an OT environment or OT team that's really managing that stuff, who do they go to, right? How do they understand? Because a lot of times the vendors don't have that expertise built in-house that really knows how to connect it. And they don't, it's not like at a power plant, which is obviously my background, as that vendor, those are larger vendors, and they manage the entire system. You're dealing environments that have multiple vendors, and they just have their little piece. But from an asset owner perspective, they want to be able to see all that stuff and get data back from those things and manage those things. And that's where that networking layer, it's really complex. Like, networking's been around a long time, but unless you have a networking background, it could be like, overwhelmingly difficult to understand and connect. And then when things break, you're like, I don't know what happened. Like, can you help me out here?
Yeah, and I think what I've noticed, we're not constrained to any particular industrial vertical.
Right.
We're in water, wastewater, we're in oil and gas, and food and bev, and manufacturing. And what I've noticed is, as kind of the community has grown over time, and I've gotten to know more and more people, there are certain verticals where there is some version of this discipline. Like in oil and gas, sometimes I come across these TCOM teams, and there's actually expertise at the end user in wired and wireless networking. But in a lot of these verticals, it's just not a thing. So when I try and explain to somebody outside of OT, or sometimes within OT, maybe from oil and gas that was on one of these teams, they're like, what do you mean nobody? I'm like, it's no one's responsibility. The end user assumes their system integrator who's providing this control system is going to take care of it. The system integrator is saying, like, no, we're just here to add a new line. We're not responsible for your entire network. So then there's just this hole of, like, who is thinking about the network from a holistic design standpoint to make a robust, scalable system? And the answer is often, unfortunately, nobody. And that's the whole reason we exist, is to just try and come sit at the table and fill that gap. Like I said, sometimes we're augmenting, even if it's not directly for the end user. Sometimes we're working with an integrator to help them kind of add that skill set to their team and add something to that project that has always been a pain on the last 20, 50, or 100 projects they've had.
Yeah, and it's so important, and it's something that, unfortunately, like you said, is really missed out when they're designing their systems and they're coming up with, I want to build this thing out, I want to expand it or whatever. They bring the vendor to the table. They're looking at the control engineers and all those kind of things, but they forget this networking piece. And unfortunately, or not unfortunately, the way that it works is it goes across that backbone of networking. And if something breaks there, then it can bring your process down. So if you're not designing that as well as you do your other systems, the hardwired connections and all those other things, that can bring operational things. And we joked in the beginning about it not being a cybersecurity thing. Most of the time it's not, right? Most of the time I don't have redundancy, or there's a misconfiguration, or somebody unplugged something, or there's a spanning tree loop, or any number of things have happened that bring things down, and nobody really knows what's going on. Like, it worked yesterday, something changed, nobody knows what happened, and nobody has the tools or the understanding of even how to troubleshoot or where to start. So they're just like sitting there staring at the system, and they don't know what to do about it.
Oh, and not to go shots fired right off the bat, but you said vendor at least once already, and that's an important point too. We are often getting called into systems that have, roughly speaking, been designed or are standardized by the control system vendor, right, whether that's a PLC system or a DCS-based system. And the problem is, a lot of times, like, I was working for with a paper mill customer for like a year, and the situation was there's a major DCS vendor and system present at this facility, but there's also a PLC-based system at the plant, and the two do need to communicate. DCS vendors like, here's what we do, here's what we deploy, but at this interface between the two, there's no spec, there's no standard. You know, we're coming in getting asked to like make it more robust, add some redundancy, which requires making changes on some parts of the system that are in the DCS. And so we would make the changes. I would show before and after. Here's what your resiliency and your failover looks like now. They're like, great. DCS vendor comes out, does an audit. They're like, this isn't per our spec. We're changing it back. And then I'm like, oh, cool. What's the spec? They couldn't produce a document. So right. 3 months later, customer calls back. They're like, can you come set it up again? I'm like, okay. So I set it up again. 3 months later, DCS vendor, some sort of audit. They're like, it's not per spec. It's not per the standard. I'm like, what? I would just love to see the standard that you're talking to so I can understand and consult appropriately. Over the course of a year, like, we never saw this document, and the customer had us make this change like 3 or 4 different times. I'm like, I don't understand the point of this exercise. Like, I'll keep doing it, but I don't know the point of this exercise. But it was a perfect example of everyone's kind of tunnel vision, or their responsibility in their silos of like, look, all we care about is this piece, and this poor end user sitting there stuck between a rock and a hard place, just wanting a reliable, comprehensive system, and no one's there to help them do that.
Yeah, and I've seen it for most of my career dealing with vendors, right? And vendors, and I'm a vendor, right? And we do the same thing. Like, I can't support every hardware configuration in the world. Like, you can't just go that doesn't mean you couldn't make my product work on any platform in the world, but I can't support it. So if you want to do it on your own, go ahead. Like, I'm not telling you can't, but if you want my support on it, then you have to follow the ones that we've tested and we've proven and all those kind of things. So that's where the vendors are coming from. But I think sometimes they forget the point of it. The point is that they need to integrate all of these things together. They need to have their system is not this perfect environment like it is in your lab. They have other things that are there. They bolt on and they adjust and they change, and by not allowing them to do those things, to your point, like the fact that they came back and said, this isn't my standard, but then weren't able to tell you what the standard was, is unrealistic, right? And this is where I've been successful as an asset owner, pushing back on those vendors and saying, you're not going to change my environment. You're going to accept you're going to tell me why I can't do this, and not that why I can't, but how are you going to support my configuration, because it's mine. And you're going to support it, and we're going to prove that it's not going to break anything, and then you're going to write me a little exception letter to say that this is going to be okay, because obviously it runs for 3 months, and the only reason you change it is because it doesn't fit in your box.
Well, and sometimes, I don't know, we can describe different intents to the situation sometimes, but I'll throw it into the column of ignorance, and I mean that in the true objective sense of the word. Like, there are just statements made from a vendor sometimes about XYZ will only work against this specific equipment or this specific hardware, this specific switch. And that stuff drives me crazy, because there are situations where it's true. You know, in the OT world, there are industrial protocols with real-time requirements that drive like, oh, it has to be conformance class 3 specific, and it has specific FPGAs in the hardware. I'm like, okay, I get it, Mr. Customer. If that's what you're looking for and that's what you need, you do need to follow that. But other times there's this gray area where the vendor has something that they can sell and push to you, but it's not true that it's the only way it can run. And it's that gray area and muddy area where I like to get in and help decipher what exactly are they saying the requirements are? Let's get into the technical requirements, and then I'm going to demonstrate to you why it doesn't only have to be that one. And obviously, I'm bringing that up from a financial concern reason, from a maintainability reason. Like ultimately, like I want my customers to have a better system than when I first came to them, but it's also got to be something they can maintain, which is probably the biggest challenge. As far as if I have to pick our biggest challenges, that's the biggest one. Is I'm trying to get customers to go from here to take a half step or a step forward, but I know that to take that half step or step forward, I can't give them something that's unrealistic for them to maintain based on personnel, resources, skill set, all of those things.
Yeah, and they don't have the skill set, which is why they're reaching out to you. Like they don't have that in house. The vendors don't have it, so you can't make something. I can't, and that's it's the catch-22, right? I could design such a complex architecture that I have, and you and I have talked about some of the things that I've designed in the past, and in larger organizations, gigamons and full NACs and spans on every switch and just all of these things that they're great. It's a great design. But I have to have a team to support that, right? And these smaller, medium, even larger, some very large environments do not have any staff or any skill set to support those things. So it doesn't matter. Like I could design it, install it, and then nobody ever use it. And then it's just wasting time, money, and effort. And
that's another ignorance one too. Like you mentioned, so it's definitely true that the small to mediums, they're completely strapped, right? Yeah. And I was talking to on an IT podcast a few months ago, and there was so much shock as I described these OT environments. They're like, how, what? But these systems are critical, and I don't understand how they can look like the way you're describing. And I was like, look, I want to be very clear here. When I say there's not skills, I don't mean there's not capability. These controls engineers are some of the smartest engineers I've ever met, but they're responsible for process and electrical and mechanical. Their plate is so full. And I show up saying, hey, if you want to fix this disaster of a network, I kind of need you to level up on the networking piece too. And they're already overwhelmed. Yeah. So to your point, at the larger customer, arguably they have the budget and they have the money to do it. But it's only within, I would say, the last 18 to 24 months that I've noticed this little bit of an uptick of these larger customers recognizing it. And maybe after we do a training session that we might do normally with the customer, they're identifying like, oh, we're going to need a resource for this. And they're actually putting job descriptions together and asking for help to put job descriptions together to hire maybe an in-house OT networking person, which is kind of amazing to see. Like I haven't seen that through my entire career. To finally see that recognition of the discipline and the recognition of like, we're going to need the resource and need the body or bodies to take care of the size systems we're putting together. It's been nice to see that. Again, it's early days, but just to see it start to happen, I'm like, okay, well, it's going to go this direction. It's only going to increase.
Well, and this came from, 20 years ago, these OT environments were all proprietary. The vendor owned the whole network. Network is a loose term that was used back then, right? And it wasn't really a network like we would see today. And then they realized it was too slow and too incapable, and they wanted to be able to integrate things, and everything was hardwired. And as the technology changed, and these vendors are the ones that did it, they started bringing these commercially off the shelf products. The switches, the firewalls, the VMware servers, the Windows and Microsoft, and all these things got brought into OT because it was way easier to just build on top of those things instead of designing the whole solution from the ground up. What they didn't think about is that now their customers needed a skill set that they don't have. And the vendors don't even have it necessarily, right? Not to the level when you send a service technician from, vendor A, he probably is a process person and a controls engineer and a very smart person, but the networking side, he's following a script. And I've seen it firsthand when that script fails or it doesn't work the way they expect it, that's where it breaks down. And I've seen, outages caused at critical infrastructure because the vendor's service engineer didn't know what he or she were doing, and they did something wrong. Like, for instance, building a whole new Active Directory forest with the same name and IP address as another system, and it was one big forest, and they built a new domain controller, and it obviously caused a whole bunch of problems. But again, that was because an untrained person was following a script, and when they got to a place that didn't work, the troubleshooting says, well, just build a new domain.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that caused all sorts of problems where the unit had to come down and it tripped the unit out because all the authentication failed after a certain amount of time. The tokens that they had failed, and then all the numbers in the control room and the operators, it just went to zero. So they punched the unit out because they couldn't control it.
And to your point about just kind of the types of problems and the level of networking we're talking about, I say a lot that. So I've been specifically doing OT networking for about 15 years, after 4 years doing instrumentation and controls for a consultant that mostly worked in water, wastewater. And in that 15 years time through today, I would argue that 95% of what we do is less than CCNA level networking. I mean, we are talking the super basic foundational blocking and tackling. Like, that is what we're doing. We're going into systems that are completely flat, often a lot or all unmanaged switches. And we are trying to get that customer to go to managed switches. Or if they have managed switches, they often aren't managed. There's sometimes not even IP addresses configured on them. So to actually manage their managed switches, do some basic, step one, like some basic VLAN segmentation, and get a layer 3 switch or a pair or a group of them going. And maybe sometimes I joke about baby's first firewall. And we get to that part, what I'm calling, like, if there's a maturity level of like 0 to 5 from a networking standpoint, we're taking that step one, and we are doing that step one over and over and over again. And usually we're not getting to do it because a customer's like excited and wants to build a new network. It's because the existing one has tipped over, or it's tipping over so frequently that they're having significant production outages. And they're like, what's going on, and what do we need to do to make it stop happening? We go take that step one with them, and then I try to open my mouth on, by the way, step one and that. They're like, thank you, sir, go away. We'll see you later. We'll see you later. They're like, the line's been running for a month straight now. This is great. See ya.
Yeah. Well, and you know, that was our, you know, my team that I built at that power utility, you know, that was our way in. That example I just gave a minute ago, the particular power plant didn't want us. They didn't trust us. They didn't want us there. They didn't want us touching their stuff. It wasn't until that incident happened where the vendor caused the outage, but the vendor they denied it. So it was over the weekend. It was in the middle of an outage. The vendor was coming back on Monday, and they basically called a Hail Mary. My team came in. We did some troubleshooting and understanding of what was going on in the environment, and they said, I need to know what happened that caused this issue so that when the vendor comes in on Monday, I know, is it their fault? Can we continue? Is it safe to move forward? And we were able to show with evidence and then logging and all that kind of stuff exactly what happened. And then they were like, oh, okay. Because they had just always assumed, and correctly up until that point, that the vendor was the expert. As long as they brought the vendor in, the vendor knew everything they needed to know, and I didn't need anybody else. But this proved to them that the vendor knew what they knew, but this is the information they knew, and there's this whole other piece that the vendor had not the adequate information and understanding and expertise in. So they couldn't just go to a one-stop shop with the vendor and get it all done to the right level.
Yeah, that's an interesting one too. Like when I mentioned diversity and vertical, the other thing when I started Traceroute, I was really interested just personally as far as mixing it up. I wanted diversity in customer type too. Sure. And so end users, pretty easy. OEMs, pretty easy in terms of like customers being interested in needing help. But I very much wanted to work with system integrators, and that took a while to crack. But then when it cracked, it was like a dam opened. Right. And there has been this repeat over and over again, similar situation of integrators coming to us saying, customers expect this of us. They assume we have this. It's a problem on every project. Right. We need some help. And I'm like, perfect. That's what we're here for. We're here to help you level up and skill up and be able to go out there, 3 months or 6 months or a year from today. And a year from today, it's going to look a lot different than what that conversation sounds like today. Yeah. So I think everybody's kind of, realizing it, recognizing it, whatever we want to say about it, kind of at the same time that like, ooh, there's a problem. We can't keep burying our head in the sand and think someone else is going to take care of it. And oftentimes it's that integrator end user relationship, which is the primary, the assumption is they're going to take care of it. They're going to design it. They're going to support it. And so I think everybody's kind of coming to the table at the same time saying, okay, we whatever the answer is, like we all recognize we need to level up. We need to figure out what that path looks like.
Yeah, and for you and I mean, obviously Josh and I have talked quite a bit offline and whatever, but it's funny because it's frustrating to me. It's frustrating to you, right? We've seen this and we've been standing on our soapbox, not from a thou shalt type way, but hey guys, look, we promise you, like you're missing this. Like nothing's happened yet. You haven't had a network issue yet. Like you can't wait. We don't want to wait, especially in these critical infrastructure environments, whether it's a manufacturing or whatever the vertical is, doesn't matter. You don't want to wait until it breaks. Like you need to understand and have confidence, even if it's putting your vendors through those tests, making sure like what would happen in these scenarios. It gets back to tabletop exercises. A lot of these things are good to do, and we do it in an operational side. It's not just about cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is one thing that can cause an impact to my OT environment. How many more are networking? 99% more outages are caused by networking issues than cybersecurity incidents. And even cybersecurity incidents. What's the attack vector? Many times it's the network, right? It's common. And when I was building a team, there were no OT people. That term didn't exist. Like there was no people out there. They weren't doing certifications. None of that stuff existed. So when I was recruiting people, that have never been in OT because it didn't exist. And so what was I looking for? OT networking. Could they do basic CCNA? I was looking for people that had CCNA level understanding, basic routing and switching of a Cisco or whatever. Because if you can understand that, I can teach you the rest. But everything is tied to that networking angle of connecting everything together. Then it's just different protocols, and none of that really matters. It's all basic routing and switching. It is super easy. OT networks usually are not that complex. That doesn't mean they're not hard.
Yeah, that's I think that's dead on. We teach an industrial networking class, and I would say I don't know what happened. Something happened 12 to 18 months ago that has ticked those requests up through the roof. Like we have averaged more than one a month this year.
Oh wow!
So I've got 5 scheduled through the end of the year, and that class. We hit a lot of topics, as you can imagine, but like my goal with the class is that a student walks away with a better fundamental understanding of when 2 devices are on an Ethernet network, what happens?
Right.
Like, what is the host doing before it puts it on the wire? And for every piece of equipment in between host A and host B, whether it's a switch or a router or a firewall, what are they looking at to make their forwarding decision? What are they keeping track of? And just that little description right there.
Yeah.
I feel like the ones that want to be there and are interested in this material and that little jump in understanding fundamentally shifts their ability to troubleshoot in their system.
Yeah.
Because prior to that, network very much is just this beautiful black magic box, and everyone gets some understanding of terminating Cat5 cables and looking for blinky lights, and they IP address their devices and maybe have a minimal confidence in the subnet mask value they're putting in, and even less confidence in a default gateway value they're putting in, and then they just kind of plug it in, and we always joke and call it plug and pray, right? But when things don't work or there's intermittent comms, like it is truly just a total mystery. Like, something's going on, and this is when the finger pointing starts. Like vendor or integrator or like somebody figure it out because it's happening in the box and nobody knows how to look in the box.
Well, going back to training, right, is dealing with the team and training folks up, and it's really going back to the basics. And I don't want to harp on it too much, but it really is fundamentals. Like I would harp on my team before you start troubleshooting the application or any of those. Like start at OSI model, right? I know we've talked about this before, but start at the lowest level of the OSI model. Is the cable good? Let's test the cable. Make sure it's plugged in. Is it powered on? The normal, have you turned it off and on again? Like you got to start out, but if you don't understand those things, then you're looking at this thing and you don't even know where to begin. And you're checking the mail when thinking it's going to help you with your, dishwasher. It's just, they have nothing to do with each other. Like they're
I think
completely unrelated.
One of the top questions I get on LinkedIn is, and it happens a lot, especially after I post something related to a troubleshooting exercise with Wireshark, but I get a lot of, do you do a Wireshark training, or can you teach me how to use Wireshark? And I'm like, I take a big breath and I'm like, time out. Like, could I jump on a Zoom session with you for half an hour, and explain to you what the different knobs and buttons are in Wireshark? Sure. That's not going to do you any good. Number two, like, the hardest part about Wireshark is context about where to capture, how to capture properly. And then once you even have it, knowing what the heck you're looking at, like what is normal, what's abnormal. And that, honestly, I don't know how to overcome that being something that's just something you build up over time.
Sure.
Taking captures on multiple systems and getting to know different systems well. And I also explained, like, I can't do it alone. Sure. I sit down with the end user, the programmer, the system, and I show them what I'm seeing and ask questions about expected, unexpected, that sort of thing. But my major point on all of it is, like, Wireshark's the last thing I'm doing.
Yeah.
Like, to your point, OSI model, I'm going through all these other things first. And then if I get through all of that, it's like, okay, now it's time to do some packet analysis and look at Wireshark. But it is the last thing on my mind typically. Like, I feel like that's a go-to often for the people who haven't had a chance to learn it yet. It's like, I guess let's throw some Wireshark on it. And I'm like, why? Like, why are we busting out Wireshark right now?
Yeah. I can't ping it, but let's put Wireshark on it.
Yeah.
Let's start a little lower on that. But
Yeah.
you know, if you look at it, you look at the movies, you look at anything else, it's the cool sexiness, right? It's the blinky lights, it's all the data that's flowing, and you're getting to look at all the packets and the headers and all that cool stuff. And you know, the newer Wireshark, it's got highlights, and I can click on things and protocols and all that fun stuff. But again, even if you went through the basics of it, let me ask a question. How often does it get to Wireshark to be able to troubleshoot and find the solution? And in your 6 years of doing Traceroute and all of the troubleshooting that you've had to do, how percentage wise is out of 10? How many times out of 10 is it Wireshark that's the solving grace?
1 to 2 at best.
Right. So
80%
or more
that's right.
is not
That's right.
Wireshark.
That's right. And they are, you know, they're fun and they are cool, but again, it's just about blocking and tackling and the basics and stuff like that. There's just so much other stuff that's going to go wrong first, and that is going wrong first, that it's often not the thing I'm going to right off the bat. I will say we've got one right now. You know, somebody reached out looking for help on a network that has grown organically over time, and this thing is 100 unmanaged switches deep at this point. And so we're at, 1,000 nodes or something, and there's been all sorts of issues, and the assumption is that there's network problems, and they're like, what do we do? And I was like, man, our hands are, like, I'm so handcuffed with those unmanaged switches.
Yeah.
Like, I was like, what is the appetite for an upgrade here?
Yeah.
They're like, we need to work our way through some small wins. I was like, okay, I hear you. At a minimum, I'm going to need you to take one around and, like, bounce it around for a few hours at a time to let me just get some eyes on some, like, layer one port statistics. I need to understand, like, I don't know if your cabling's good.
Right.
And I can't know that if you're not going to run around with the meter and check every cable, or get some managed switches in there and start looking at some port statistics. And so I was kind of laying out this process for, here's what we need to do. But this is not an uncommon situation to get this phone call where it's like, well, we've been having a lot of, and then I asked the question, they're like, well, it's about 100 switches. I'm like, oh, wow, that's amazing. And they're like, they're all unmanaged. I'm like, oh, no.
Which, like, between me and you, why the hell do they even make managed switches anymore? The price point difference between a managed switch versus an unmanaged switch is it has to be less than zero. So, I mean, they shouldn't exist. Like, throw them out the window. They should be boat anchors.
It's funny. So I still, so the only social media I'm on is LinkedIn, because the industrial automation community is pretty active on there. And to be in our 6 years of business, every single customer we have has found us directly on LinkedIn, or were recommended by someone who is connected to us on LinkedIn, because I'm pretty active on there and sharing solutions and talking about products and all these different things on there, talking about troubleshooting events. And it's just been interesting to watch what that dialogue is like as that network has gotten bigger. So I still regularly get into conversations where people are like, I don't like managed switches. We just do unmanaged switches, and I don't think people need managed switches. And I'm like, time out. Let's have a bigger conversation. And it led to, like, I did this 2-post series about unmanaged versus managed switches that is probably not the one you're thinking it is. It wasn't just a blind praise of the managed switch.
Sure.
It was also flagging that an unconfigured or poorly configured managed switch may seem worse than an unmanaged switch.
Yeah.
And so I went through some points like default spanning tree being on and what that can look like when you plug in 10 managed switches with spanning tree on by default and you do nothing.
Right.
You get these like ghosts in the system. People think that there's something wrong in their system because somebody power cycles a panel, and then all of a sudden there's just like this calm outage that like sweeps the network and then settles out. They're like, this doesn't happen when we have unmanaged switches. I'm like, ooh. Let me explain why.
You're right.
And then let's go. Yeah. Let me explain why, and then let's go fix the problem. This isn't as simple as like unmanaged switches are better,
right? Because
I don't get this event. But it does mean you got to manage those managed switches. You can't just deploy them blind and expect them to be well. But I understand. My whole point is I understand why this opinion gets formed and how sometimes the managed switch gets a bad rap because people have this kind of negative or bad experience with them. I remember when Cisco came back to industrial, they had like dipped their toe with that old 2955 brick, and then they disappeared for a while, and then they came back. And when they came back and I got like those green IE3000s and I set up on my desk, there was all these defaults on there, like port security defaults and spanning tree defaults that led to, if you just daisy chain two IE3000s together without any configuration, you'd end up with one of them going into error disable, the port to the second switch going into error disable, and so you could not get two switches daisy chained like you could a pair of unmanaged switches. And I was like, ooh, I wonder how this is going to go for them. In industrial, because you're going to have somebody spend $6,000 or whatever, put two on a table, they can't get two devices talking across two switches, they're going to get frustrated and throw it through the window. And that's the exact type of thing that happened at scale. Is people tried to spend the money, they tried to go up, they had this experience, they're like, I don't know what's happening, but when I do unmanaged switches, this doesn't happen.
Right.
So part of this I kind of put on the vendors too, as far as like not understanding who their customer is.
Yeah.
And, you know, I guess my whole point is I can't put all the blame on any one side. Like all these things contributed to a very bad experience, and it has led to this delayed maturity or delayed interest in maturity from the end user perspective.
Well, and it happens a lot in OT is they get burned. So OT asset owners get burned for whatever reason, whether it be IT forced them to use a certain Cisco switch. And to your point, Cisco expects all of their end users to be CCIEs, not CCNAs. They expect them to have somebody that's a CCIE or better that has an understanding of all of those things. So they wouldn't be a problem. They would know to turn off port security and to change the spanning tree configuration and all those types of things. Whereas you and I are looking at it from a different perspective. Hey, how about you just default that to none of those things on and I'll enable them, right? Which seems backwards. Like, you know, you mean you're going to turn security off by default? Yes, because I need it to work first. And then I can sprinkle on the security settings and test them one at a time instead of everything being turned on, nothing working, and me just throwing the box in the trash and going to something I know worked, the Netgear switch I bought at Walmart, because that's what they're going to do.
You just described what I assume. You could say better than me, but every technology related cybersecurity initiative, like in the early, like this is how they all failed, right? Because they got deployed in some sort of secure first manner, which frustrated the controls team or the operations team because things that were working aren't working, and they get mad very quickly. And when you start impacting production, they're gonna go to 11. They're gonna say, "Rip it out. We're not using it."
Yep. Yeah, I have multiple stories I could tell, but you know, one of them was the vendor did application whitelisting. So that they brought in this McAfee antivirus, you know, the McAfee EPO suite that had the antivirus or the whitelisting enabled on the control system. It's a DCS vendor, right? And so they turned it on and they had it. The problem is the way that the way that whitelisting works is you basically put it in learn mode. You execute all the functions that you want to do, and then you lock it down. Like you solidify. I think it was called Solid Core at the time. I don't even know what it's called now. But you know, you basically say all these things are good. The bad thing is especially in OT spaces, sometimes you only run a process once a year, once every 6 months, once every 6 weeks. So if you didn't do that in that window, as soon as it tries to kick off something that wasn't approved before, it doesn't work. So this happened. We rolled it out during an outage.
Okay.
You know, the control vendor had signed off on it. The operators were good with it. Everything was functioning. The networking, everything was working. We leave outage. They're running the unit. Like a month later, something happened. They need to kick off a process that they had not kicked off in that initial process. And sure, it didn't work. Solid Core did what it was supposed to do. Whitelisting blocked the application because it wasn't on the approved list. So it blocked it. But that meant that their process didn't work, which means they had to, all these domino effect of things happen. So what did they do? They turned the whitelist server off. Now that didn't stop whitelist because it was running on the endpoint, but that's what they did. And they wouldn't let me turn it back on. And I had to fight to explain to them, if you want me to turn it off, then I have to turn the server back on to disable the agents because it's the only way to make it stop whitelisting. But it was foreign to them. And from there, it was hard to get them to trust anything because, again, they'd been burned. And this is what's happened in OT with networking and firewalls and all of these things is they've been burned by a managed switch because the vendor brought it in. It didn't work the way as expected. And like you said, I've never had these problems with an unmanaged switch, right? And instead of looking at why that is and why, you know, the root cause of what caused the issue, and understanding that you actually get a lot, if it's done correctly, a managed switch is far superior in every single way to an unmanaged switch. But if you don't do it, like the use case you gave is a perfect analogy of why these OT spaces, some of them are 10 years, 15 years, 20 years behind. And when you approach them like, no, we're good. We'll keep what we got. We know it works. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
I remember being at the table with the new customer at a refinery. This is probably a decade ago now. And we were going through some topics in terms of network improvements. And so one of the topics was increased layer 2 redundancy. The current system didn't have any. They didn't have any layer 2 redundancy. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, hang on. My phone's trying to steal my headset. Let me kill the Bluetooth on this.
I saw it start blinking.
Yeah, let's see here. There we go. Okay, they didn't have any layer 2 redundancy at the time, and they had described some incidents where it seemed very clear to me that some layer 2 redundancy would help them. So we're talking about rings. Rings are the shape of preference in OT because every industrial switch vendor has at least a proprietary ring technology and then maybe some industry standard ones that several vendors adopt. But for a number of reasons, they're just commonly deployed in OT. And so we're talking about rings, and so one of the people for the customer cuts me off. They're like, "We don't do rings over here." I'm like, "What's that?" They're like, "No, we won't do any rings at this facility." I was like, "Say more." And then the other guy like bumps him, and he's just like, "Self-healing rings, more like self-destructing rings." And they're like laughing with each other. And I know what happened because I'd seen it 20 times before. Like somebody tried to get it going. It wasn't configured properly. And then when they tested it or when they had a real incident, it was probably catastrophic. And I was like, I suspect it was never configured properly. And I'm confident I can demonstrate to you, we can do it on a bench first with the proper configuration. Because sometimes with those things, it's also about how you go about configuring it, especially if it's brownfield, right? So we talk about, opening the situation up and the order in which you configure it, working outside in, depending on whose protocol it is. There's all these nuances that you have to take care of to do it properly. But when you do it properly, like they work, they're bulletproof. They work really well. But it was just another one of those examples where I'm like, oh, you got burned once. And I can just tell this is going to be an uphill climb to convince you that they're a good thing when properly configured. We did get them there, but man, it was a typical case of like, we've seen this before. It's garbage. We don't like it. Not in our system.
Yeah. And honestly, I think one of the ways around that, not around it, but to solve that problem, because most of the time it is lack of understanding. So the asset owner doesn't understand this technology, the thing that you're talking about, because they can't grasp their head around it. They just stick with what they know. They stick with the safe option, what's worked in the past. That's why they choose unmanaged switches, right? So I think one of the things that you're focused on, obviously being in at the table and helping them and doing that example is great. But the next step to that is improving and increasing the number of people that have basic understanding of networking, right? The training that you're offering, right? Because that gets them to understand these difficult concepts. Not that they're going to go out and configure those redundant rings themselves, but they understand how networking works and why it failed and where it failed. And then it was a misconfiguration. It was not a limitation of the architecture necessarily or the capabilities of the product. It was a misconfiguration. It was a human error, right? If somebody didn't know what they were doing and they configured it incorrectly. Like, it's not that the switch is bad or that Cisco sucks. It's just that somebody didn't know what they were doing when they implemented it. And
it's funny. So the path to get them there was the integrator who knew this end user very well.
Yeah.
They suggested, like, we need to bring in some barbecue and we need to do a demonstration. I was like, cool. Tell me when. And so they filled up the room, brought in barbecue, and it was just basically a lunch and learn on layer 2 redundancies. So a little bit of PowerPoint, a little bit of hands-on demonstration. Come up here, pull a cable, let's do this. And then they're like, okay. And then there was total buy-in, but no one had ever taken that time and had the expertise or experience to show them, like, here's what you need to know about it. Here's how it operates. Here are the configuration requirements. This is what it looks like when it's set up properly. So sometimes it's literally, I would say, I mean, the wall behind me, the reason it exists is because I know this from so much time in the space is like, I just got to show them. Like, I got to show them. Like, demonstration says so much, especially if they've had a bad experience, to get them off of that. Is I need to show them the UI. I need to show them what the configuration looks like. I need to show them what troubleshooting it looks like. There's all these pieces that until you see it or put hands on it, you're just going to go off your previous experience. And I don't blame anybody for that either.
No. Why would you? Like, why would I take your word for it? I've seen it before and it didn't work. So what about you makes that different? You know, I think I mentioned this to you before, and I know I mentioned it on the podcast, but I've built multiple large-scale lab environments, right? And for that is one of the main use cases. In fact, I think one of the most successful use cases of those labs is that very thing. And it's because these OT people are very much, because of the examples that you've given, they're hesitant to change and go to these new capabilities. They've been burned in the past. Their name is on the line for the availability of these assets, not me as an integrator, right? Or not me as an OT asset asset owner or anything coming from corporate. You know, I told my team I was going to get them shirts that said, "I'm from corporate, I'm here to help." And, you know, that way they just kick us out as soon as we got there, right? But, you know, I built these $1 million plus labs and we'd build an entire control system. We'd have all of the switches, the firewalls, the SEL relays, like all of the things that they had in their space. Because when they came in and I wanted to do this demonstration, it didn't make sense. They didn't believe it if it was a tabletop exercise. They wanted to see their equipment, their configuration, devices when they look in their environment that they see, okay, yep, we have that and we have that and we have that. Okay, now you can make all these things work together and then you can disconnect it. And I can show that it's still able to work and do its job, even though I disconnected one of those switches and broke that ring. But I have redundancy. Like, we were able to show them, and it's that, you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. A lab was worth 1,000,000. Like, I was able to walk people from the C-suite, you know, the CFO and the CEO, the CISO, et cetera, that level of folks through and give them a demonstration all the way down to the plant operator. And it's a different story, but it was all around knowledge transfer and training and building rapport and letting them get comfortable with this complex thing that they don't necessarily understand. And to your point before, I really want to hit on this. It's not because they're not smart. They are some of the smartest people in the world. This is not their skill set. It's like, I would argue I'm a smart person. I know you're a smart person, but, you know, you don't want me to do surgery on you. Like, that's not where my intelligence is. Like, you and I can talk OT networking for hours, but I have no idea how to reconstruct a knee. That's just not my skill set.
I'm with you.
But that's really what it comes down to is we've got to, as vendors, as solution providers, you know, companies like you, it's super powerful and needed for bridging that gap of knowledge. I think that's one of the things that's made me successful in my career is I've been the asset owner. I've been the, you know, in the seat working the outages with the operators and the control engineers, but I've also been on the other side, managing OT and the IT side and the cybersecurity side and all of that. So I kind of see both sides, so I can talk to those folks and make them understand, not in a degrading way, but oh, why you're so stupid? How do you not understand this? Like, it's not that, because they're not, like we said, they're not. It's more just, oh, okay, I understand what happened. Let me show you.
Yep.
Let me prove to you what happened and show you why it happened and how we can make sure that doesn't happen and how it's actually better for you and what the benefits are.
The other one that's fun and challenging sometimes is it's like the security one, that phrase in security, that security and convenience are on opposite ends of an unbendable pole.
Right.
This thing comes up a lot. Like, oftentimes our projects are not necessarily in the context of cybersecurity, but they are in the context of operational resilience and robustness and scalability. And when we take one of these flat networks and we segment it to where, like, each line is its own VLAN on a food and beverage floor or something like that, and after this change, they're clearly more robust. They went from this single broadcast domain with 1,000 devices to now every line is its own. And so that problem that happens on line one doesn't take down the whole floor.
Sure.
So they're in until that first time that controls engineer opens up his laptop and he opens up RS Links and he uses his discovery driver, and he used to see all 100 PLCs at the same time. And now he's only getting the PLCs on line one. And they call, they're like, wait, what's happening here? And I was like, oh, this is by design. Let me talk you through it. Let's look at this other driver where you specify by, but you can still get to everything in this routed environment, but it's going to be a different way. And that it's just one example of several like it, where they're like, this doesn't feel as convenient as it was before. And I just got to get them over to the other side of the river. And we always get them there. I take them to the other side of the river. I'm like, okay, here's how you're going to have to do it from now on. But here's the benefits you're getting from that change that sometimes feel a little invisible. But I would say almost all of our projects start with that incident, right? Like, they've had the outage or they're having multiple outages. And so when we get them to the other side of that river, where it's like, oh, you've got 48 uninterrupted hours now. Oh, you've got a week. You've got a month. Like, clearly this has made a significant operational resilience change. So I promise it's worth it. Like, come with me to the other side. It's nice over here. But every now and then there's these little behavior changes or getting used to a different way to do something or get to something that is something we got to, just hold their hand through.
Yeah. That's the key, right? Is understanding, meeting them where they're at. And you're not walking in with a sledgehammer and killing everybody in your wake and just get out of my way. What is it, Saturday Night Live, where the IT guy comes in and it's just move, I'll do it. Yeah. That's obviously not going to win hearts and minds, right? That's not how to win friends and influence people. It's meeting them where they're at and understanding why they have those concerns. And again, putting on that hat and knowing that the reason they're hesitant is because they're responsible for these things. Like, their bonus, the bonus of the people that are working there, their availability of that system. They're the ones that get called at 3 o'clock in the morning on Friday when it's broke, right? Not you, not me, not the control vendor. They are, right? So they're hesitant to put things in that they can't fix, that they don't know how to resolve. So getting them to understand how it's going to make their job better, easier, more efficient, and how you can show them, hey, I'll teach you how to troubleshoot this too, so that you're capable to do these things when you get called at 3 o'clock in the morning. So you're not always having to just pick up the phone and call Josh, even though obviously you're happy to do that, but sometimes they need to be able to do some level of basic understanding, your class that you talked about. They need to be able to get to step 1.5 of understanding basic layer 2 routing or networking, and then a little bit of IP and network and routing type, VLANs, and get into some of those basic, again, CCNA type, class type stuff, which is not all that hard to get somebody to understand. It's concepts that people can do if they're willing to have the conversation and really put in a little bit of time. It doesn't take a lot to get that level of understanding where they can really get more comfortable with these systems and these configurations.
The other piece we haven't touched on, and we should, is I feel like we've exclusively been talking about the controls and operations side, and we haven't said much about IT yet. And we both know, and I'm sure everyone who's listening is aware of IT OT friction. I'll leave it at that term for now. But we're often, when I talk about who we're working with, oftentimes we're getting asked to, can you come to this meeting between us, the controls group, and our IT department. And we're playing literally translator at that table. I'm trying to take whether the initiative is something on the control side or something on the IT side, and I'm coming up with the language or the analogies to say, okay, when they say this is what they mean.
Right.
It's not as scary as it sounds. It's
right.
like this thing in your control system or vice versa. We had a call the other day. It was, it was food, and it was controls and IT, and it was their head of IT who, at their company, I would say the IT reach into the control system goes a little bit further than I would say is what is typical for most of my customers. So it extends a little bit further into the plant floor, and the controls team was wanting to look at deploying NAT at the head of some of these islands to do some data collection. You've seen some of these conversations online where IT people start showing up. They're like, what are you guys talking about? Like, why would you be doing, like, just re-IP it? What is wrong with you? And especially when they see some of these where I'm talking about overlapping islands and doing that for multiple, they're like, okay, cool, good job, Josh, but why are you so stupid? Just go re-IP everything. And I'm like, stop. And so we had one of these exact conversations the other day where I was explaining, like, first of all, your IT environment, let me guess, it's all DHCP. They're like, yeah, like, so it's pretty trivial to re-IP. You change the DHCP scope, everybody reboots their machines, you're done.
Yeah.
I was like, number one, are you aware that the devices in the OT network, they are 99.9% of the time statically IP? They're like, what? They're like, why? We talk about that a little bit. I was like, okay. And now I just wanted to, they're like, okay, I get it. That sounds painful. They got to go re-IP it manually. I'm like, that's not it. It's not just about changing the IP on the device. That IP has code in it, has logic in it that might have a message instruction targeting another device on the network by its static IP. So if that thing's changing, now the programming has to change. Like, it is not a trivial task to re-IP. This could be a weekend, it could be a week, it could be a couple of weeks in recon to just figure out what is the lift and the effort going to be. But it is not trivial, and that is why we're having this NAC. They're like, okay, we did not know this. This makes a lot more sense now. I'm like, I understand, it's cool, but that's another example conversation where there's just a lack of awareness of the significant environmental difference between an OT system network and an IT system network.
Yeah, and obviously that's why I host this podcast, right? Is I want to get that knowledge out there, and it's amazing how many times I've, both from hiring people from IT to come in and work in OT spaces, and me trying to train them and successfully most of the time, training them and getting the dirty IT-ness off of them and training them to be an OT person, right? Because I have that too. I came from an IT background as well, so I have IT and OT in my background, but it's amazing. We're 2023. OT is not a new term anymore. It's not 2010 where nobody understood it. Like it's not a dark hole. Like everybody knows it's there. Like again, I have almost 40 episodes of a podcast where I talk about this stuff every single week, and I'm not the only one. There's other good podcasts out there. There's resources out there. SANS has OT courses. Like all of these things are out there. People are talking about, like you talk about it all the time on LinkedIn, yet there's so many people that just have no idea. And unfortunately, well, not necessarily unfortunately, but OT exists everywhere. You don't have to be a power plant to have OT. Yet, yes, that's the example I use a lot because it's the most dramatic, shutting down the grid and, bad actors in China and Iran, blah, all that kind of stuff. But it's also the IoT in your house and the stuff, elevator controls and HVAC controls and trains and anything in the world that has automation. If I can tell it to do it from my phone or from a computer or automate it, it's OT. Like as soon as there's a physical process, and almost every business has some kind of OT in it. Now maybe they don't have as much as others, but they're all OT. And unfortunately, you hit it before, and I really want to bring it back, is there's a whole bunch of gray area when that IT and OT comes together, and even in OT, like you said before as well. But even in that OT and IT, where does IT stop? Who has it when they don't cover it? And usually there's a gray area in the middle that nobody really owns. It's like no man's land that you hope nothing breaks because everybody's like, I don't know, it's not me, it's you. Who did this? Like what happened? And
it's like the Lion King meme, it's that, what's that area over there?
Yeah. We don't go over there. Just ignore that. But it's true, and it's we're never going to have, we can talk all day long about all the cybersecurity tools in the world and protecting and firewalls and all the great things that we need to do. But I get back to foundations. That's one I always harp on, understanding my assets, what's in my environment. But networking, in my opinion, is one of the most important, pivotal, foundational things that you have to do in any space, IT or OT, but it's very much lacking in OT, and it's hard.
Well, when you said the sentence earlier, and I'm sure I'd said it earlier, but the bottom line, like in that IT to OT friction, for example, all those conversations, or when I see the question organizationally, how do we get IT and OT to work together better, blah, blah, blah. Like I have my top answer to that question is like, don't be a jerk. Like that's step one. Because the organizations in which it works well, the thing I see in common is that like the head of IT and the head controls guy, they're not jerks. Like that's the key to success. And then they keep their soldiers in line.
Yeah.
But that literally is the problem, is because on both sides we're saying they just don't know.
Yeah.
Like calm down, stop being so angry.
Yeah.
It's not that they're idiots in both directions. I'm having this conversation with the controls people. I'm having this conversation with the IT people.
Yep.
They, on the other side, they just don't know. Like they don't have the same training you have. So like settle down, don't be a jerk, and don't talk down to people when you're trying to explain some 50th acronym that nobody's ever heard of that isn't in your discipline. Yeah. And somebody had done a post the other day about IT acronyms and how painful it is. And I was like, how are you acting like this isn't a problem in OT as well? And then I rattled off 50 OT acronyms. He's like, oh, yeah, I guess we do it too.
Yeah. Everybody does it, right?
It's
the same thing. It's the same thing in your relationship. You're married. It's in relationship with your wife. Don't be a jerk. If you guys are misunderstanding, assume the best. Assume she doesn't understand. Assume that he doesn't understand, right? And it's the same thing in OT and IT and all of these spaces is work to try to understand their perspective. Like if IT and OT, and one of my mentors told me a long time ago, I love this saying, I say it a lot, but all business is the people business. I don't care if you're the janitor, if you're the CEO. You have to be able to talk to people. Once you get the people thing, everything else falls in line. So a great example, I was at a power company. We were buying this power plant. The local OT guy there didn't like us coming in, and so he and I were butting heads because I was telling him, hey, we're going to bring your plant into the standard that I've built at all these other sites, and he didn't like it. He didn't understand it and all those kind of things. And you know how I convinced him, or how I got to him? I started talking about something we had in common. Right? Yeah. It had nothing to do with technology. No amount of telling him how networking worked or any of those other things. That's not what bridged that gap. What bridged the gap is I started talking about jujitsu, right? We started talking about something that we liked in common, and he's like, oh, okay, you're a cool dude. Okay, so can we talk now? And then we were able to have conversations where he was actually listening.
Yeah, and I've said the same thing to both sides, is like, why don't you go take him to lunch or take her to lunch and like just get to know, like have a human relationship first,
right?
And then find that common ground, and then we can figure out what we need to do on each side. And I've watched some examples of this play out so beautifully that I wish I could hit the clone button or like take a syringe and like move it to, another organization. But it's always the thing that's in common, is that when it works, there's people at the top pushing down this culture of like, don't be a jerk.
Yeah.
Raise the issue, raise the understanding level. I remember I helped one of the water utilities with that a little bit, in terms of they were asking for these sessions, these little mini sessions, to just take a specific topic that is an area of friction. And, on one week it was kind of educating the IT side, and on another week it was kind of educating the control side. But at the end of 2 months, there was this much better, more patient, more open, more understanding position towards like the things that would happen over the next 6 months or a year, as they were now all of a sudden everybody had just kind of leveled up on their understanding of like, oh, that's why that's not so easy to do on that side, or that's why that takes a little bit longer than I would expect, or any of these things that originally you're judging just kind of blind.
Sure.
You're just like, that seems terrible, and why is it so silly, or why is it so stupid?
Well, and if you think about Undercover Boss, that TV show that's on, right? And that's the concept, is you go into these spaces to try to understand their perspective. Why is it difficult? Why is it costing so much? Why is it so inefficient? It's easy to look from the ivory tower and thou shalt and send edicts down the street, but but when you get in the space and you understand them as people and their concerns and what's going on, you have that empathy and you're able to see problems from a different perspective, right? So it doesn't matter if it's IT versus OT, or it's the OT guy versus the controls guy, or it's the controls guy against the vendor, or it's the OT guy against the vendor. Like it's the same conversation with different people at the table, right? If you can all just get everybody to the table and just start out with, you know, the icebreakers and like build on, let's make sure that we all understand who each other are instead of just jumping into the architecture, because that's where we have the disagreement. Let's find things that we agree on first, and then let's find things, then we can get into the meat and potatoes down the road. We got plenty of time for that. So with that said,
go for
with
it.
that said, what is, we talked about a lot of things. A lot of them are scary. A lot of them are you know, dark or whatever. But what's one, in the next 5 to 10 years, what's one thing maybe on the positive side you see that you're excited about, like changes that you've seen coming up over the horizon, and maybe what's one thing that's concerning over the next 5 or 10 years that, you know, you really feel we need to tackle before things get worse?
So I don't know if it's going to be the one or not, but from a technology standpoint in OT networking, the thing that I've been excited about for a few years, and I'm hoping to see more players and more adoption and deployment, is SDN. I feel like SDN can completely change what it looks like to manage an OT network. There is so much headache associated with doing things the right way from an administrative standpoint. We talked about upskilling, and I talked about not wanting to elevate a customer's network, but not wanting to overburden them from an admin perspective. And a lot of that pain comes from like learning and understanding VLANs and the pain of deploying VLANs and how easy it is to make a mistake. And it comes from these layer 2 redundancy protocol. And all of these things that can be the hardest things to like learn and manage and deploy, a lot of that kind of disappears and is taken care of with SDN. And so right now I would say the space is light. Like I'm aware of 2 vendors kind of paying attention, building solutions for OT specific SDN. Obviously from generic traditional networking, there's 20 vendors. So I'd like to see more development in the space, more adoption in the space, the capabilities and the technology just like rapidly iterate. But I do think it is the delta, and it's where we have to get to, basically. So much of what has happened in the last 5 to 10 years in our space has been around wanting to look at lateral traffic movement or visibility to more traffic. And it's all been very difficult to accomplish because the architecture and the technology available in traditional networking makes it so. You and I have talked about wanting to fast forward to like sensor in the switch and full visibility and all this stuff. And SDN gets us there like in the snap of a finger. And so I'm like, yeah, this solves so many problems. So I would say for sure that's the one I'm the most excited about. I feel like that like SDN could take me into retirement. Like I could just be doing SDN until I retire. And I think it would be better for everybody involved. We just need the platforms to mature. I need more participation. I'm never one to want to count clearly on like one vendor. So I like to have options. I want to see what different people's approaches look like, but I feel like it could be the one. I know that it hasn't taken off in the IT, taken over in IT the way some people thought that it might, but I think there's a number of reasons that's the case, and some of them aren't always the technology reasons. There's commercial and political reasons why that can happen. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that maybe it does make an impact in OT.
Yeah, obviously we talked about that. We have a friend in common that we've talked extensively about SDN and their solution for that being one of those vendors, I'm sure. But yeah, I agree. Like there's a foundational thing that goes there that can fix a lot of the problems that we have and experience in OT. Being able to get visibility, the layer 2 type redundancy and configuration and all that complexity kind of goes away. And all of the the lack of understanding of my assets goes away too, because to really do SDN, I've got to understand what I have, or I can't build the connections and all those kind of things. So I'm killing a lot of birds with one stone. If we get to a place where we can have SDN, man, our environments are light years ahead of where we are today in almost every way. So it makes it securing and making it more reliable. All of those things are just vastly more capable and competent than we are today in an OT space for sure. So what's the thing that concerns you, keeps you up at night over the next 10 years?
Oh, that if SDN doesn't get there, are we stuck trying? Because to be honest, from a leveling up these network standpoint, the challenge is the ones we've enumerated, right? That we need rapid upskilling, resources dedicated to, but I completely empathize with that effort. Like, it is not trivial. Right. Like, it takes a lot of work, a lot of manpower, and a lot of oversight to level up these networks. There's a lot of things that are, easy to deploy, but I have verticals that I work in where it's not kind of like a substation, which relative to other ones feels fairly static.
Sure.
I'm often in these environments that are rapidly changing. You know, they're adding hosts or moving hosts around daily, if not multiple times a day. And those are extremely challenging to administer. So if it's not SDN, I'm literally just heads on a swivel looking for how are we going to solve this problem? Like, right. The word that drives me maybe the craziest from a marketing standpoint is microsegmentation. I feel like that one's been dominating our space for the last couple of years, and it's just going to get louder. And it clearly doesn't mean the same thing to every vendor that has a microsegmentation solution to deliver. And they can look very different. There's a whole bucket of them that effectively is, well, take your existing network today and deploy whatever you want to call it, inline IPS, inline firewalls, but you're basically needing to add hardware in line in between the existing network infrastructure and the assets you want to identify and protect, which I think, just looking at your face, I mean, that's a cumbersome proposition. And I recognize that as well. And I'm like, boy, is that the best we can? There are situations where I think it's totally appropriate and it's doable. But I picture, anytime I look at a solution or an architecture, my mind goes immediately to different customer environments of mine, trying to picture, like, what would that look like there? And sometimes it's like, oh, I could put it there and there. There's no way I could deploy it in these 5 systems or these 10 systems. And I'm just kind of fascinated by the evolution of both these things, like microsegmentation and what those solutions look like, SDN. And I'm just wondering, like, what is at the apex of this thing? I don't buy that the solutions I'm seeing today for microsegmentation, I don't buy that they're the end game. I buy that they're a transition thing that you might want to do in certain environments, and it's going to buy you something. But I don't buy that it's the end game for a greenfield install 5 years from today.
No, and I've seen it, many years ago implemented very poorly. We had a bunch of /30 networks, all over the place, and everything was, nothing worked, nothing talked to each other. It was super complex, and you want to add that much complexity again without the ability to manage it, like an SDN or anything like that. It provided some security, I guess, if you configured it correctly, but anytime you made a change, you're having to make changes in so many places, and there's so many more hardware. It just spiraled out of control. It was complexity for complexity's sake, right? It checked the box for, this should be better, right? If one subnet's good, then 30 is way better, right? Yeah. Not always, right? And more complexity, especially in these environments, complexity does not equal better. We need it to be able to work, and we need these people that are skilled. They're multi-skilled. They have different skill sets. They're not going to be weak. We don't have budget to have a CCIE level network engineer at every facility managing all these microsegmentations. It has to, if it's going, anything that's going to work in this space has to be super simple and easy to understand, right? And deploy remotely and support, all of the high availability type stuff that we're doing without this level of complexity. It gets crazy. So I agree.
My 2B is there's been a shift. Like, I would say for the past 15 years, the vast majority, like the over 80-90% of the environments I'm in, are the controls network is the responsibility of the controls team, operations team, engineering team. It is not IT's responsibility.
Right.
That percentage where it is IT's responsibility has been ticking up as a direct result of cybersecurity interest and initiatives. Sure. And I get it. Like, I get why that has been the answer, is C-suite saying, IT, I need you to go take that over and get it under control. Yeah. I'm not convinced it's the right situation for most customers. Right. But I agree that today I don't feel like the tools are available to make it easy for controls to do it. So that's another intersection that I'm very curious in. Like this single digit percentage that I feel like it's climbing, is it going to continue to climb, or is the technology going to become available that's going to allow the controls and operations team to manage their own networks? Maybe it's just because of where I started and my background, like my bias and my interest is I want it to stay in the hands of the controls team.
Yeah.
But I'm very interested in watching what that intersection looks like.
Well, and I agree with you again from my background as well. It's the same thing, like going back to cybersecurity. When I say like a SOC, I've always advised, CISOs, et cetera, if you don't have a dedicated OT SOC, you at least need a dedicated OT SOC analyst. Like you can't just throw OT data into an IT SOC and expect them to know what they're looking at. Right? No more than I would expect IT to be able to manage an OT network. If you're going to do that, then you need to take one of your IT people and plop them out and say, you are no longer managing IT networks. You are only managing OT networks. You're going to go do day in the life. You're going to follow these plants. You're going to go to their outages. You're going to sit in their meetings. You're going to understand their business process. You have to become an OT person and with the skills that you had from IT, and then that can be super successful. But if you're just trying to sit at corporate and push down your IT policies in an OT space, they're just going to lock the door and not let you in. Like they're going to be like, yeah, that ain't happening. I'm going to block you at the gate. You're not allowed in here. So good luck with that. Have a nice day.
Yep.
And I'm going to call Josh, who's going to come behind you and fix everything anyways. All right, man. So give us your call to action. I know you got a couple of classes coming up, all that kind of stuff. How can people find out about those classes and how to get a hold of you?
Yeah, so our training classes have normally been, it's an end user and integrators trying to get an entire group trained. And so we're training 5, 10, 20, we've done 75 at a time before. But I get a lot of individual pings, whether it's, an individual employee at an end user or I call them solopreneurs, like these solo system integrators looking to level up. And it's been hard to accommodate, these one-on-ones just from a time and commercial standpoint. So we're going to start with the first class in February in Dallas. We've got one scheduled for February 8th and 9th in Dallas. We'll throw the link in the show notes. And that was just an open call. We're taking registrations through the end of October, and we'll tell everybody where it is by the exact location by the end of November. And that's the exact class we were kind of talking about before. It's a 2-day industrial networking class to just get everybody from that to that first step basic understanding of how traffic moves across an Ethernet network. So that's the big thing on the agenda in terms of open training. And we'll probably, I have a feeling based on the response to this first one, it's probably going to end up being something that we're just regularly scheduling as 2 times a year, 4 times a year. There's going to be a open one at these locations.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a great thing. It's a need, as we know. People are needing to get this, whether they're like you said, a control engineer that wants to understand more what their vendors are telling them, or what IT's pushing down on them, or whatever those things are, taking their destiny in their own hand and really understanding those things. And there's not a lot of places to go. Like, yeah, you can take the SANS course, but that's diving off, and it's not OT networking specific, right? It's a lot of other things, but it's not just that. And this, in my opinion, the networking is the key. Right. If you get that, the other things can be bolted on. I can teach you the other stuff. It's what I go back to on my training. When I'm onboarding new employees that were not OT, credentialed. Right. They didn't come from OT environments. If I can teach them, if they understand the networking thing, the rest is gravy. I could easily teach them those other things, but it all really comes back to networking. So
the top question I get as LinkedIn DMs or on posts, the number one question we get over and over is like resources. Like how do we level up on this? I was like, and I send them this list of links, and I'm like, some of this is generic, it's not OT specific, and then some of these are from vendors, and some of this training is vendor gear specific, and then some vendors do some open ones. And then there's our class, and I wish I had more answers for you, but it is kind of light picking out there today. Right. So that's another thing I'm hoping to see more of from additional people participating in the space, whether it's integrators, solution providers, also recognizing this need and putting more material and training classes out there, because we're a small consultancy. We can't serve everybody as much as I'd love to. Yeah. So I don't see any of it as competition or anything. I'd love to see 10 other solution providers putting 2-day training classes on, because we need it.
Yeah. It's definitely a void for sure. Maybe I'll come by and ask some really dumb questions during your training for the class.
I'd love it.
Awesome, Josh. Hey, man, thank you for the time. Love the deep dive. I'm sure we'll probably do this again because we really just scratched the surface of all things OT networking and the skills gap and all the complexity and all the things. I mean, we didn't really talk very specific, but it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I've always really tied on the networking side and really focused on that being the key to success in these OT spaces. When you start bolting on cyber or even just operational reliability and functionality, it all comes back to the networking side. If the networking isn't there and it's not reliable, then nothing else matters. It doesn't matter any of the other stuff I do. Like, I've got to have the networking dialed in. So I appreciate all you do, man.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you highlighting it and having me on. Always fun to talk.
Yeah, man. Awesome. Well, have a good one. We'll see you soon.
All right, you too.
Thanks for listening to the Protect OT Cybersecurity Podcast. If you got some valuable information from today's show, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about Aaron and to get your free copy of the OT Cybersecurity Solution Buyer's Guide, go to industrialdefender.com. That's industrialdefender.com, or you can click the link in the show notes.